Okay, so I'm going to be doing some talking about the different design projects and different projects that I was working on in the latter half of the term. So I did quite a lot, and I'm going to start with one called Hide and Shriek. Now, I'll explain the background to this, and then I'll explain choices we made, why it didn't continue, and so on and so forth. But I'm not actually going to show the game because the game was created to be a kind of multiplayer experience. And this was done when Among Us was very big a few months ago. We were looking at asymmetrical multiplayer party games, and I teamed up with an artist called Seb Burnett, who did the Bertram Fiddle games, which were adventure games. We did a bit of stuff and worked on this for about a month. So I'm not actually going to show the game because the game is not really a game yet. It was just a framework built to showcase multiplayer stuff. And in fact, it wasn't multiplayer at all. It was built single player, and we cut it to make it look multiplayer. And I'll explain how that was met at the other side. So I think in some respects, the best way to look at this is to go through the pitch document. So I'll go through this kind of as if I'm doing a pitch, but I'll do lots of asides. And this is Hide and Shriek. And this is the trailer which I put together, which has that facsimile of multiplayer. I've had a lot of visitors to my house, but very few seem to have left. So if you come prowling, I very much hope we'll meet.
Guys, I think he's just come into the room where I'm in. I think it's the ballroom.
Yeah, just give us two ticks, guys. I'm just going to go up to the attic because I've still got to. A skull, a chalice, a dagger.
Yeah!
Okay, so that's Hide and Shriek. So obviously what we're going for in terms of design is, I'm just going to skip on from this. We don't need to look at this. But yeah, I will have all the links if you want to see more of the slice gameplay in here. We're obviously looking at stuff like Edward Gorey and Gramleyville Shambles, Old Victoriana, which is very much Seb's style. And we wanted to create something that was super visually accessible, especially to sort of people who are, into board games but aren't necessarily into playing computer games. What we're finding, obviously, is with Among Us is that often quite sort of janky and simple games were taking off because they allowed for asymmetrical multiplayer, which means that people can use their brains, they can socialize, and they can play in a non-traditionally competitive way. So a multiplayer cooperative game of hide and seek set in a haunted Victorian house. And the idea was that players would work to banish the monster before it consumed them all. And so what would happen is there'd be various places where you could collect treasures by solving puzzles. And when you collect enough treasures, you'd be able to conduct a banishing rite in one of the rooms in the haunted house, which was quite extensive. So the game's made up of two sides. Both sides are controlled by players, with one being the monster and the others being the children. They collect the treasures, the children, and when the rite is completed, the game is won, and it's the monster's goal to catch all the children before the rite is completed. So the players are encouraged to communicate through voice chat, and if they're killed, just like in Among Us, they can participate as ghosts. So this was very much the style we were going for: Dickensian Victoriana, Edward Lear, Edward Gorey, and the idea is that the artwork would perfectly match the themes of the game, make it fantastical and immersive. We wanted this to be a game for the moment and beyond, so it would appeal to the Among Us crowd, but also there'd be a degree of strategy and a sort of timeless art quality, which would make it go beyond that. And then I was working with Seb, and this is me. Our audience. So obviously in our lectures we've talked about personas, and I thought that this would basically appeal to three types of people. I've got Lucy, who's a fan of like online stuff. She's starting with her Twitch channel. Cyril, who's into competing and finding winning strategies and wants to boss everyone around. And then Joanna, who's into Victoriana. And between the three, we felt there was a market of sort of 14 to 32-year-olds. We needed a certain amount of funding. We were actually looking for a very small amount of funding, and this is where the problems really started, which I'll talk about in a second. We were looking for a small amount of funding in order to create the game or create a prototype, and so we had a very small scope for this game. The scope was basically to create a one-mode multiplayer, and we needed money for the multiplayer engineer. And when we'd completed this pitch deck, I took it to some people, including some games agents, and there were some issues raised, which was one, multiplayer is always a very dicey thing. Two, this game is in many ways too small. So agents won't get out of bed for less than so many grand, and games publishers are unlikely to want to fund stuff without proper return, which doesn't necessarily seem to make a lot of financial sense, with proportional investment, but is very much the case. And this one was uncomfortably small for a lot of publishers. It just wasn't worth getting into. So there was a lot of, this seems like a good idea, this seems like a great idea, but we can't handle it. As in, we're not going to handle it. And so we had letters back from Tiny Build and stuff like that saying, looks great, love the art, don't want to use it. There was also a second problem, which is that it was just not unique enough. And although the art style was somewhat unique, I came to realize that actually this idea of asymmetrical multiplayer, because of Among Us, and because in some other ways, it's actually kind of quite obvious, with the large amount of games that already exist, in the real world that can be adapted to this, like hide and seek, is there were games like Secret Neighbor, which was being made by Tiny Build and other things, and everyone was really trying to get into this asymmetric multiplayer party. And I came to realize that I hadn't necessarily done quite enough market survey before this, and I just assumed that people would be wild for this sort of thing. But actually, I was coming up against the fact that there was already great competition in this space. And something, as an indie developer, I've found is that when you don't have competition in your space because you're making something unique, that's when you have the chance to really cut through. So I was finding it very, very difficult to cut through, and I was getting knocked back a lot. I felt that the product wasn't unique enough in terms of gameplay, and there were all sorts of problems and also all sorts of long-term concerns which would potentially, if it did get go-ahead, would endanger my course and then also future career prospects. And I didn't think that I necessarily wanted the hard-edged life of being an indie dev. So I left this one behind pretty much just before Christmas. But yeah, I think it was an interesting design proposition. I think we got to do lots of work, which you can see in both the game slice and the trailer. Aesthetically, it was very interesting, had a clear vision, but to my mind, in terms of gameplay, wasn't quite developed enough, didn't quite sell any convincing price point, either very, very cheap or expensive, would have had problems with server maintenance, and yeah, just didn't quite cut through the masses enough. So that's my take on Hide and Shriek, and next time I'm going to be talking about Star City.